The private dining suite on the 43rd floor was engineered for intimidation. Low amber lighting, velvet acoustics, and a table polished to a mirror so flawless it reflected every hesitation. It was supposed to be a confidential pre-negotiation supper, a warm-up ritual before a $240 million heritage acquisition. Instead, it was the kind of room that whispered consequences. He arrived first, Nadir al-Khalif, the Gulf billionaire whose voice could freeze an entire boardroom. Tonight he carried the impatience of a man who believed he was minutes away from owning a manuscript older than half the world's nations. The pen was already in his hand. Obsidian black, custom-made, balanced like a dagger. She entered quietly behind him. The waitress, thin, understated, moving with the gentle precision of someone trying not to disturb the air. Her apron was immaculate, her steps rehearsed, but her eyes carried a tired alertness, as if she spent most days anticipating damage. She poured his water. He smirked. Then, in a clipped Gulf dialect meant to sting, he muttered that her accent sounded like someone reading from the wrong end of a dictionary. He expected her to flinch, maybe apologize. Instead, she set the carafe down with careful grace, lifted her gaze just a little, and answered him in flawless classical Arabic, not the dialects of markets or living rooms, but the ceremonial register scholars used when opening ancient texts. The room froze. Even the pen in his hand paused. He watched her retreat toward the service door, suddenly unable to place her. She didn't belong to this floor, or this salary, or this role, and yet she spoke like someone who had walked the halls of forgotten libraries. He stared at her walking away, unable to understand how he had missed someone like her. The silence that followed her departure thickened the room, turning soft velvet air into something granular. Nadir al-Khalif remained seated, but his posture shifted, the slight forward lean of a man trying to reclaim dominance after losing it for a fraction of a second. Across the wide table, his two hired experts exchanged uneasy glances, a Swiss provenance advisor who never blinked, and an American curator who always talked too much. Both sensed the tremor in their employer's pride. She reappeared moments later, carrying a silver tray with 3 crystal tumblers. No one spoke. No one dared. The billionaire tracked every step she took, trying to decode her again. A waitress with perfect classical Arabic? It contradicted the hierarchy he trusted. She placed the glasses down. "Where did you learn that register?" he finally asked, still in dialect. Her reply came in English, quiet but precise. "At the university, before I had to leave." That was all. She didn't elaborate, and that, paradoxically, made the room lean closer. Her voice carried neither bitterness nor apology, just the weight of fact. The Swiss advisor attempted a polite chuckle, trying to restore the evening's hierarchy. Impressive. But let's continue. Time is short, and we have much to brief you on before tomorrow's signing. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the folder on the table, the thick one with gilded corners, the one she had been instructed not to touch. Even from across the room, she could sense the wrongness in its weight, the stiffness in its spine. Old documents breathe differently. They sag. They whisper. That folder held its breath. She stepped back toward the wall, head down, trying once again to disappear. But invisibility was never simple for her. Not after the academic collapse that had shoved her into this building. Not after the debt that grew heavier than any manuscript she'd ever carried. Not after years of working jobs where people spoke around her as if she were furniture. She had mastered silence to survive. Tonight, silence felt dangerous. The experts began their pitch, praising the manuscript's flawless provenance, its unbroken chain of custody, its impossible purity for an item of its century. Their voices rose with enthusiasm, but their language lacked something she could feel, but not yet articulate. At first, it was a faint discomfort, like hearing a note played half a tone too high. Something about the phrasing, something about the certainty, something about the way they avoided specifics. Her pulse quickened. She tried to swallow it down. She tried to remain invisible. But intuition has a way of dragging truth toward the surface, even when the cost is survival. Power ignores what it cannot see, until it can't. One small truth always cracks first. She retreated to the corner near the sideboard, pretending to polish a stack of unused glasses. It was a practiced gesture, hands moving, eyes lowered, presence minimized. But inside, her mind churned with the old ache she kept buried under double shifts and overdue notices. Invisible. That had become her entire existence. She had once walked the quiet aisles of a university archive, fingers brushing vellum older than empires. She had once believed her dissertation would rescue her from the poverty she had been born into. But when her scholarship vanished in a bureaucratic pivot and her mother's medical bills doubled overnight, life compressed into survival. Now she was here, on the 43rd floor, serving men who would never imagine she had ever held a manuscript with gloves. The American curator's voice dragged her back to the room. He was rambling again, overconfident, imprecise, and the calligraphy cycles are entirely consistent with the period. Perfect ligatures, no overwriting, no corrections, absolutely pristine. Pristine. She flinched internally at the word. Nothing from that century was pristine. Perfection was a modern fabrication. Nadir tapped the pen against the contract folder, a faint metallic click that echoed off the glass walls. "And authentication?" he asked. "You are certain?" "Beyond certain," the curator insisted. "This is the acquisition of the decade." Her breath caught. Experts never used absolute language. Not real experts. Only salesmen. She tried to stay out of it. She tried to stay silent. But her training, no matter how deeply buried, had instincts that refused to die. She looked up inadvertently, just for a second, and found the Swiss advisor staring at her with cold calculation. He knew she had noticed something. He just didn't know what. Nadir followed the advisor's gaze and turned toward her. "You. What is it?" His voice held a note of command, not curiosity. She froze. The tray in her hands felt suddenly too heavy. Her throat tightened. If she spoke, she risked her job, maybe the last stable income she had. If she stayed silent, she would spend the rest of the night watching a $240 million mistake unfold 3 feet away. "I'm not part of the presentation," she said softly. Nadir's jaw tightened. "But you reacted. Tell me why." Her pulse hammered. The room seemed to close around her. She glanced at the sealed folder. She had no right to comment on it. No authority, no protection. And yet, walking away from truth had cost her too much already. She lifted her chin a fraction, just enough for her voice to carry. "Documents of that age," she said, "are never perfect." The room went still. The experts exchanged sharp, defensive glances. Nadir leaned back, assessing her again with new eyes, calculating ones. Her invisibility was gone, and once lost, it could never be reclaimed. Silence can protect you, until the moment it betrays you. The temperature in the room shifted, subtly, but enough that even the dim orange sconces seemed to hesitate. The Swiss advisor straightened his cuffs, preparing a diplomatic dismissal, but Nadir lifted a hand, silencing him without looking away from her. "Explain," he said. Her breath trembled in her chest. She didn't want this attention. She didn't want the spotlight of a billionaire's irritation. She wanted the safety of anonymity, of menus and trays and quiet hallways where nobody asked questions. But he had asked, and she had never been good at lying. "I just meant," she said carefully, "that age leaves traces, imperfections, even in the most preserved collections. The idea of something being perfect is unusual. The American curator forced a laugh, sharp and artificial. With respect, miss, this isn't a matter of intuition. The manuscript has undergone every modern test. Fiber analysis, pigment dating, humidity indexing. She didn't move, just listened. And the more he spoke, the more a faint nausea rose inside her. The phrases were wrong. The terminology was too broad, too generic. A real report would speak of specific wavelengths, margins, quill angles, binding thread patterns. But he listed methods like a salesman reciting menu items. Nadir heard it too. His eyes narrowed. You said, humidity indexing. For parchment? The curator swallowed. Well, in context, the Swiss advisor cut in smoothly. Our team simplified the explanations for the pre-brief, sir. His tone was immaculate, but the micro-tightening around his eyes betrayed frustration. The staff should not influence the tone of this meeting. Staff. The word was a slap. She lowered her gaze, but it was too late. Nadir had seen the flicker of hurt cross her face. He hadn't decided yet whether he liked that or not. Stay, he ordered when she tried to step back. If you noticed something, you'll remain for the presentation. Her stomach dropped. Being forced to stay meant exposure, and exposure meant risk. It meant her manager would ask questions. It meant the experts resenting her. It meant her entire fragile arrangement, rent, hospital bills, immigration paperwork, could collapse. But sir, she whispered, I'm just service staff. Not tonight, he replied. The Swiss advisor's jaw tightened. The curator's smile wilted, and she felt the walls pulling closer, narrowing her options. They opened the folder. Thick vellum sheets, cream-tinted, edges trimmed with obsessive neatness. Too neat. She felt the wrongness before she even stepped closer, the way one feels the tension in a room before hearing the argument. The experts launched into their polished speech again, insisting on integrity, legacy, certainty. But all she could feel was that quiet, growing dissonance. A whisper of danger layered beneath their confidence. She didn't yet know what was wrong, only that something was. Intuition is the first alarm when power refuses to listen. They arranged the vellum sheets across the table like a ceremonial offering. Soft museum gloves, careful spacing, the choreography of legitimacy. But even from the far edge of the room, she sensed the imbalance, the way the pages resisted the light instead of absorbing it, the unnatural crispness in their posture. Old vellum should soften under gravity. These pages stood too tall, too proud. Nadir reclined in his chair, but his eyes were sharp, following every movement. He was no longer watching the experts. He was watching her. The Swiss advisor resumed the briefing in a tone forged for investors. Smooth, clipped, engineered for trust. As you can see, the margins are intact. No trimming. The binding holes match the period's stitching patterns, and the ink, rare, mineral-rich, exceptionally stable, confirms an early 9th century origin. Her throat tightened. Ink is never that stable. She moved slightly, pretending to adjust the placement of a water glass, but really to get a clearer angle on the manuscript. Under the warm light, the ink lines glistened. They should not have glistened. Centuries-old ink dries into the fibers. It does not reflect, does not shine, does not catch the light like something still finding its place on the page. She swallowed hard. The American curator spoke next, practically glowing with confidence. What's remarkable, sir, is the lack of palimpsest activity. No scraping, no overwriting, no reapplication. It's absolutely pristine. That word again, pristine. A word that belonged in marketing decks, not forensic reports. She felt the discomfort sharpen. It crawled across her skin like static. She kept her face lowered, trying to hide the storm rising inside her. Her training had been fragmented by the life she now lived. Library nights replaced by double shifts, academic peers replaced by wealthy patrons who didn't see her. But knowledge doesn't disappear. It waits. Nadir tapped the vellum softly. "You're sure there are no inconsistencies?" "None whatsoever," the advisor replied. She exhaled slowly. That was a lie. She didn't yet know how she knew. But she knew. A quiet panic bloomed in her chest. If she spoke now, she could be dismissed, humiliated, fired. If she stayed silent, a fraud worth more than her entire lifetime of earnings would go unchallenged. She glanced at Nadir again, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. His expression was unreadable, but one thing was clear. He was no longer convinced by the experts. He needed one more signal, one more anomaly. Her fingers trembled around the tray she held. She forced them still. The Swiss advisor continued, voice tightening as he sensed the billionaire's shifting mood. "Our conclusion is final. This manuscript is without flaw." Her heartbeat thudded once, deeply. No manuscript is without flaw. One imperfection always reveals the truth. The presentation deepened, drowning the room in confident jargon and curated certainty. The experts spoke as if they were architects of history itself, shaping narratives, dictating truth, expecting obedience. But beneath their confidence, something trembled. She could feel it. A thin crack running beneath the smooth surface of their performance. The curator lifted a page with gloved hands, illuminating it under a directed lamp. Observe the flawless alignment of the calligraphy. Every stroke, every loop, every terminal, exactly consistent with early Abbasid standards. The word exactly echoed inside her like a warning bell. Consistency was a myth. Ancient scribes were human. Fatigue, candlelight, humidity, distraction, personal habit. Even the most disciplined script showed variation. A hairline widening, a tremor at the end of a long night, a rush in the final stanza. But the strokes before her were unnervingly uniform, like a machine imitating a human hand. She stepped forward halfway, just enough to appear helpful. She adjusted a salt shaker, repositioned a cloth napkin, anything to get closer without being accused of overstepping. The vellum edges caught her eye. Too smooth. Not the soft fraying of age, but a calculated symmetry. Her breath hitched. She blinked slowly, controlling her expression. It couldn't be modern vellum, too risky, too detectable. But reconditioned vellum? Restored margins? She would need to get within a meter to know for sure. Her fingertips twitched with the phantom memory of cataloging rules. Always check the grain tilt. Always inspect the ink sink. Always read the margins first. But she couldn't. She was a waitress. Her proximity was already suspicious. Nadir leaned forward, sensing the tension coiling in the air. "You're unusually quiet," he murmured in her direction. "Do you see something?" The Swiss advisor interjected instantly. "Sir, she is not trained for material evaluation. We should proceed with the valuation confirmation." His interruption was too sharp, too urgent. The billionaire noticed. She felt the advisor's eyes slice toward her, warning her to stay silent. She dropped her gaze, but her mind kept racing. The curator moved to the contract packet, opening the final verification page. "Tomorrow, sir, with your signature, this becomes the crown jewel of your collection, a manuscript untouched by corruption." That phrase froze her. Untouched. She knew why the phrasing bothered her now. Manuscripts from that era nearly always carried faint erasures, margin corrections, accidental transfers, because perfection was not the goal. Preservation was. Authenticity was. A text untouched by correction was a text untouched by history. Her chest tightened. They were selling him the idea of purity, because purity allowed a higher price. She looked again at the vellum, and suddenly it clicked. The surface tension was wrong. The pages carried a faint stiffness, a rigidity in the fibers that suggested recent rehydration. Someone had softened the sheets, flattened them, then recalcified the surface. A delicate operation, but a detectable one. She exhaled quietly. The trap was real. But revealing it now, without evidence, without access to the pages, would destroy her. She stepped back, heart pounding. The experts pressed forward, eager to rush the final pitch. Nadir's pen was still resting on the contract folder, spinning lazily between his fingers. Every second dragged the room closer to disaster. Some traps hide behind brilliance, others hide behind confidence. But the most dangerous ones hide behind perfection. The evening pressed on, tightening like a silk cord. Outside the panoramic windows, the city glowed in ribbons of gold and indigo, unaware of the 240 million deception unfolding above it. Inside, the air grew denser, less oxygen, more tension. Every breath tasted like risk. The experts moved into the final assurance segment, a theatrical euphemism for repeating the same claims with louder confidence. They projected slides onto the glass wall. High-resolution images, spectral scans, sections of script enlarged to heroic proportions. It was a flawless performance, too flawless. No pauses, no hesitations, no uncertainties. She'd seen real scholars speak. Real scholars lived in uncertainty. Only liars clung to perfection. She stood by the sideboard, absorbing everything, pretending to polish a wine decanter, pretending she wasn't drowning in the urge to intervene. The Swiss advisor clicked to a slide showing spectral luminescence. As you can see, the ink dispersion indicates natural aging. No modern compounds. The scan confirms total authenticity. She felt her pulse bang against her ribs, because the spectral scan was wrong. It wasn't the data. She couldn't see that from here. It was the format. Real spectral reports used a standardized layout from 2 major labs, both of which she'd studied extensively. The margins were wrong. The axis labels were wrong. Even the color palette was off. An aesthetic choice, not a scientific one. They hadn't just forged the manuscript. They had forged the forensics. Her throat closed around a wave of fear. She looked down, pretending to fold a linen, but her hands trembled. If she exposed the lie, they would turn on her instantly. If she stayed silent, she would watch a billionaire sign away a fortune and watch criminals walk away rich. Nadir leaned back, assessing her again. She didn't realize he was watching until their eyes met for the briefest moment. He saw the fear, he saw the conflict, he saw the knowledge she was trying to bury under obedience. "Bring her closer," he said suddenly. Her heart stopped. The Swiss advisor stiffened. "Sir, that's unnecessary. I'd like her opinion. She is not qualified. She speaks classical Arabic better than your curator." The room went deathly still. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to protect the fragile, crumbling life she balanced on minimum wage and luck. But Nadir extended his hand toward her. Not gently, not kindly, but with command. "Come." She stepped forward, slowly, each footfall a negotiation between terror and duty. She approached the table. The vellum lay before her, illuminated, pristine, impossible. The American curator smiled tightly. "Just don't touch anything." These materials, she didn't hear the rest, because the moment she reached the manuscript's edge, her breath caught. There, a micro warp in the fiber alignment, almost invisible. but unmistakable to someone who had spent years studying ancient pages under magnification. Her chest tightened. It wasn't the decisive anomaly yet, but it was the first one she could prove. Her life was about to split in two. Courage begins as a single, almost invisible tremor. She leaned forward with careful, practiced restraint, close enough to examine the page, far enough to avoid accusations of contamination. The vellum rested under the lamp with an eerie stillness, its surface too uniform, its shadows too obedient. Ancient pages never behaved this politely. Her fingers hovered a breath above the margin, not touching, just feeling the air. Old vellum has a scent, faint, earthy, a trace of time compressed into protein. This page offered almost nothing, a sterilized neutrality, a page without history. Nadir watched her intensely. The Swiss advisor shifted beside him, his patience thinning. "Sir, this level of scrutiny is unnecessary. These imperfections she thinks she sees are simply the result of conservation." Her pulse tightened. That word, conservation, was often used to excuse inconsistencies. But conservation obeyed rules, precision, documentation, clear, transparent intervention. Nothing about this page suggested careful preservation. It suggested concealment. She lowered her head, eyes narrowing at the grain. The fibers ran in a perfect vertical line. Too perfect. Natural vellum fibers drift subtly, curling near the edges, bending with age. Here, the pattern was machine regular, as if someone had pressed the sheet in a controlled environment, flattening out the decades, ironing out the irregularities. She inhaled. Then she saw it. A faint shimmer, barely there, along the lower left corner. Not ink, not natural oil, but the residue of something synthetic, a stabilizing agent. Used only when a vellum sheet had been softened beyond its natural tolerance and needed to be fixed into shape. Her heart slammed once, violently. She straightened. The American curator laughed too quickly. "Is there an issue?" She ran her thumb through the air above the shimmer. "This corner," she paused, careful, controlled. "It has tension." The Swiss advisor's voice snapped across the table. "Vellum always has tension." "Not like this," she murmured. Nadir's eyes sharpened. "Explain." She exhaled slowly. This was it. The first anomaly spoken aloud. The first step onto a ledge she couldn't return from. "When vellum is rehydrated and flattened," she said quietly, "the fibers resist. They harden when dried too fast. They create a tension you can feel even without touching." She nodded toward the corner. "This sheet was softened recently." A beat of stunned silence. The curator's composure cracked for half a second. It was enough. The advisor stepped forward, his voice icy. "Sir, she is speculating. These are conservation artifacts." But Nadir wasn't listening to him anymore. He was leaning in, absorbing her words with a growing, unsettled intensity. "Recently?" he repeated. "Yes." Her voice barely carried. "Within the last few years." The curator swallowed hard, because that single detail collapsed the timeline of authenticity. Ancient vellum required centuries of stable storage, not recent workshops, not chemical treatments, not hands trying to force age into compliance. Nadir pressed his palms onto the table, slowly, deliberately. The trap had cracked, barely, but enough. She felt the expert's eyes burning into her, their confidence wavering, their scheme losing balance. This was the moment frauds fear most, the instant someone nameless notices the first impossible detail. The room constricted around the moment, like a throat tightening before a scream. The expert stood unnaturally still, trapped between outrage and panic, while Nadir remained motionless, except for one detail. the slow, steady rotation of his pen between his fingers. A habit he had when calculating risk, and she had just shifted the entire calculation. "Show me," he said. Her breath hitched. She hesitated, knowing one wrong move could cost her everything. She pointed, not touching, just indicating the margin. There. The grain lines bow inward. Natural vellum warps outward from age. This was pressed. The American curator's voice cracked. "Pressed? That's absurd. She's a waitress, not a conservator. She doesn't have the expertise to make that assessment." She stayed silent. She didn't need to defend herself. The artifact did it for her. Nadir angled the lamp closer. The light caught the synthetic sheen again, just a glint, but enough to betray the intervention. His jaw tightened. Why wasn't I informed of any conservation treatment? The Swiss advisor jumped in too fast. Because it was minimal, purely stabilizing, standard procedure. But the curator flinched at the word minimal, and Nadir saw it. A single micro-expression, too fast for amateurs, obvious to predators. She felt a surge of dread. They were losing control. Cornered people made dangerous decisions. The advisor pivoted sharply toward her. This is derailing a crucial transaction. She is misinterpreting complex technical phenomena. Her heart raced. She knew that tone. The dismissal. The attempt to push her back into silence, into invisibility. But she also knew something else now. If she didn't speak, right now, these men would bulldoze the truth. She inhaled, steadying herself against years of fear. "May I see the colophon page?" she asked softly. The advisor's eyes widened. Too much, too quick. Nadir noticed. "What's on the colophon?" the billionaire asked. The curator stammered. Nothing unusual, just typical closing script. But she stepped forward, gravity pulling her toward the truth. "Old colophons," she said gently, "carry fatigue. The scribe's hand wavers, ink thins. If the final page is as perfect as the others," she swallowed, "it would confirm the pattern is artificial." A hush fell. The advisor moved instinctively to block her line of sight. That was a mistake, a massive one. Nadir sat up straight, his voice slicing the room clean. "Move!" The advisor froze, then slowly stepped aside. The manuscript's final page lay beneath the lamp. Perfect, steady, unwavering. An insult to history. She felt something inside her break open. Not fear, but clarity. This wasn't a mistake. It was a construction. A trap designed to exploit a rich man's pride, his desire to own something unownable. Her breathing steadied. "Nadir," she whispered before she could stop herself. This manuscript was manufactured to look ancient, not preserved, rebuilt. The room exploded in tension. The curator's voice cracked into panic. "She's wrong. Completely wrong. This is slander." The advisor snapped. "Remove her. Now." But Nadir didn't move. He didn't blink. He stared at her as if a door had just opened in a room he thought he owned. And then he did something none of them expected. He reached for the contract. The pen hovered over the signature line. She felt a surge of terror whip through her, because if he signed now, the fraud would crystallize, and she would be nothing but a footnote in the disaster. "No," she said suddenly, her voice breaking through the room like a crack of glass. "Stop." He froze. Everyone stared at her. The billionaire. The experts. The quiet city lights behind them. Her pulse thundered so loudly she could barely hear her own breath. This was the moment, the cliff edge. One sentence would decide the fate of $240 million. One sentence would decide the fate of her entire life. Truth becomes unstoppable the moment someone dares to say it aloud. Her voice had barely left her throat when she realized what she'd done. She had interrupted a billionaire mid-signature in this world that bordered on sacrilege. The Swiss advisor's face drained of color, then flushed with fury. The American curator's mouth hung open, locked between indignation and fear. But Nadir stayed still, pen suspended, breath controlled, eyes fixed only on her. "Speak," he said. A command, not an invitation. Her knees almost buckled, but she stepped closer. The table's glow lit her face from below, turning her features into something sharper, like truth carving its way upward. She pointed gently toward the text block, careful not to touch. "The ink sequences," she whispered. "They're wrong." The curator scoffed. "Ink sequences? What does that even—" "Quiet," Nadir snapped without looking at him. Her throat tightened, but she continued. "In authentic manuscripts, the ink settles into the vellum unevenly. Age pulls it deeper in some strokes, shallower in others. It creates a topography, tiny differences in elevation." She leaned closer to the lamp. "This surface is flat, perfectly flat. That only happens when ink is applied on already treated vellum, not vellum aged over centuries." A stunned silence fell. The Swiss advisor forced a cold smile. "You're confusing conservation with fabrication. Surface flattening is a known result of—" She cut him off, her voice suddenly stronger. "No. Flattening softens strokes." She pointed to a thick loop in the calligraphy. "These strokes sharpened." Nadir blinked. "Sharpened?" She nodded. "Sharp edges mean the ink rested on top of the fibers, not within them. It's modern handwriting imitating ancient script." The curator shook his head aggressively. "That is a baseless claim. You're making wild accusations without credentials, without tools." Her voice softened. "The baseline angle is wrong." The advisor froze. She reached toward the margin, again not touching, only indicating. Early 9th century scribes wrote with a specific wrist rotation. Their baseline drifts upward on final lines because their posture tightened late at night. Every authentic manuscript from that region carries that fatigue. She looked at the final line of the page, perfectly horizontal. Machine straight. "No human hand from that era wrote like this," she said. "Only someone deliberately imitating them. Someone who practiced, rehearsed, and finally produced this." She motioned at the spotless page. "Perfection is the evidence." Eh? The curator let out a weak sound, somewhere between protest and surrender. Nadir leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice low. "So you're saying this is forged?" Her chest tightened. This was the moment that could ruin her life. But she didn't look away. "It's reconstructed," she said. "Modern ink, reconditioned vellum, synthetic stabilizers. I can't see the entire chain yet, but the pattern is consistent with workshop fabrication." A beat. "Someone is selling you an artifact that never existed." The advisor's mask shattered. "This is madness. Sir, she's inventing pseudo-technical language." She turned to him slowly. "Then show us the provenance documents," she said. "The real ones. With transfer seals. With customs certifications. With the acquisition dates before restoration." A hit. A direct hit. The advisor's breath caught. The curator swallowed. Nadir's eyes locked on them like a predator, finally realizing which animals in the room were prey. "You have those documents," he said, not asking, stating. Neither expert moved, neither answered. A storm gathered behind the billionaire's stare. She felt the tremor in the room shift, power realigning, truths uncaging, consequences sharpening. For the first time tonight, she wasn't the one who felt afraid. Deception unravels fastest when silence becomes evidence. The silence was no longer silence, it was exposure. A raw, electric stillness that wrapped around the experts like a tightening wire. The Swiss advisor's jaw flexed once, twice, a small, involuntary tick that betrayed the panic he fought to hide. The American curator tried to steady his breathing, but every inhale sounded like confession. Nadir set the pen down with surgical precision. "Bring the provenance file," he said. A simple request. A death sentence. The advisor hesitated. Only half a second, but half a second was enough. Nadir caught it. She caught it. The whole room caught it. "There is no issue with—" the advisor began. "Bring it." Nadir's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It carried the weight of empires. The curator rushed to retrieve a leather portfolio from his briefcase. His hands trembled as he unzipped it. Out came the documents, aged, yellowed, carefully staged. Too carefully, she stepped closer, pulse pounding, drawn by instinct stronger than caution. Nadir didn't stop her. In fact, he angled the pages toward her, granting access he would have never given a waitress an hour ago. She examined the first sheet. The paper was artificially tinted, tea-stained or chemically yellowed, but the real problem was the ink. Transfer seals were supposed to bloom into the fibers, soft at the edges. These seals were crisp, clean, laser clear. Her stomach dropped. "These seals," she whispered. "They're printed." The curator choked. "They're not printed. They're stamped." "No," she pointed gently. A stamp leaves pressure, compression, a slight indentation in the cellulose. She angled the paper under the light. "This has none." Her voice steadied. They scanned real documents and printed the seals. The Swiss advisor slammed the folder shut. "Enough! This is character assassination. We don't need to entertain baseless theories from someone—" She turned to him, meeting his fury with quiet certainty. "You didn't forge the manuscript," she said softly. "You forged the trail." A vein pulsed at the advisor's temple. "You rebuilt the vellum from scrap fragments purchased legally. Then you commissioned a calligrapher skilled enough to imitate early Abbasid forms. After that, you treated the surface with synthetic stabilizers to mimic age. And finally," she touched the leather folder, "you fabricated the provenance to justify a 9-figure valuation." The curator's knees buckled. He gripped the table. Nadir didn't blink. Not once. His voice was a blade. "How much would I have lost?" She swallowed. "Everything you were paying, plus the cost of legal recovery. The moment you signed, the burden of proof would shift to you." The billionaire stiffened. "Explain." She met his gaze. "The contract likely contains a clause stating that authenticity challenges must be proven by the buyer, meaning even if you proved fraud." She breathed out. "You would still lose." A tremor of rage passed through Nadir's shoulders. He reached for the contract packet, flipped to the fine print pages, and there it was. A clause buried deep in legal phrasing, obscured in ornate language but unmistakable once seen. Her chest tightened. She had been right. A trap disguised as history. A fraud disguised as perfection. A contract disguised as protection. And now the billionaire understood it fully. Power shatters when truth hits the exact fracture point. The contract lay open under the light, a polished instrument of betrayal. The clause she'd predicted sat there like a quiet landmine, a reversal of burden disguised beneath elegant legal flourishes. Nadir read it 3 times, each pass carving deeper fury into his expression. The Swiss advisor spoke first, voice trembling beneath forced composure. "Sir, that clause is standard for rare item acquisitions. It protects both parties." "Both parties?" Nadir's tone was ice. "It protects you." The advisor opened his mouth, then closed it again. No defense he could offer would survive this moment. The American curator tried instead. His voice cracked. We intended no harm. The manuscript was represented to us as authentic. We simply— Don't insult me. Nadir rose slowly. She stepped back instinctively, but his gaze softened just slightly when it landed on her. Not kindness, respect. A recognition he couldn't yet articulate. He tapped the contract with one finger. You expected me to sign first, before any independent verification. The advisor swallowed hard. That is standard for pre-auction. Stop calling it standard, she whispered. Her voice was fragile but unmoving. The room shifted toward her again. She stepped closer, drawn by the gravity of truth. Standard procedures never hide verification clauses in ornamental language. They never bury authenticity disputes under confidentiality codes. They never prohibit third-party inspection before payment. She pointed to a section halfway down the page. This paragraph prevents him from withdrawing if the manuscript is proven fraudulent after transfer. It locks him into liability. Nadir's jaw tightened so sharply she heard a faint cracking sound, the sound of teeth meeting pressure. He turned to the advisor. You plan to let me sign? Then disappear behind legal firewalls. No reply. Because there was nothing left to hide behind. But she wasn't done. Something deeper tugged at her, a scholar's instinct, half forgotten, but still alive. May I? She asked, gesturing to the contract. Nadir nodded. She scanned the pages, her eyes sharpening. Years of archival training returned, muscle memory guiding her. Then she froze. There, she said. Subsection 14C. The advisor blanched. Nadir leaned in, reading. His breath caught. This was the real trap. She whispered almost to herself. This clause nullifies warranty if any non-designated consultant examines the manuscript. Nadir blinked. Meaning? Her voice steadied into certainty. Meaning the moment I looked at it, just now, you technically forfeited all protections. The curator whimpered. The advisor's mask shattered. Nadir went still with lethal clarity. It was brilliant. It was monstrous. They had designed the perfect legal snare. If a non-approved expert evaluated the manuscript, the billionaire implicitly accepted the item as is. Any imperfections would become his liability. And tonight, they had maneuvered him, subtly, confidently, right to the edge of that trap, until she stepped in. Her stomach twisted. If she hadn't spoken when she did, if she had stayed silent, he would have signed into a financial abyss. Nadir closed the contract slowly, deliberately. When he lifted his gaze to her, something had changed. Not in him, but in the space between them. You saved me, he said quietly. She shook her head. No, I just told the truth. He studied her for a long moment. Truth, he said, is never just. Deception collapses fastest when courage refuses to look away. The room seemed to tilt, so slight that no one moved, yet so profound she felt the shift in her bones. The balance of power had inverted. Moments ago, she was invisible. Now every pair of eyes in the suite was anchored to her, terrified of what she might reveal next. Nadir eased back into his chair, but his posture radiated command. Calm, dangerous command. The kind a man adopts when he realizes he has been hunted and decides to become the predator instead. Explain the full mechanism, he said, his voice low, steady. All of it. She swallowed. Are you sure? Yes. So she breathed once, steadying her hands on the back of an unused chair. The lamp cast her shadow across the manuscript, thin, fragile, human, and yet the most powerful force in the room. The trap works in 4 layers, she began softly, each designed to look harmless, each escalating the moment you sign. The experts stiffened. They knew what was coming. First, she said, pointing to the manuscript, they built an artifact that looks perfect. That's the bait. Most collectors ignore microscopic irregularities, but a perfect object gives the illusion of divine provenance. It blinds the buyer. Nadir nodded once, slow, absorbing. Second, she continued, they constructed a synthetic forensic trail. Fake seals, printed stamps, a timeline engineered to resist scrutiny unless someone reads the margins. The inconsistencies. The curator's hand shook. He hid it under the table. Third, she said, lifting the contract. They wrapped both the object and the lies inside a legal net, one that reverses responsibility. If you sign, the burden shifts to you. Even if you prove fraud later, you still lose. It's written to outlive truth. Nadir's eyes darkened. She turned to the final section. Fourth, she whispered, they sabotaged the concept of authenticity itself. The Swiss advisor exhaled sharply, unable to keep still. This is outrageous. No, she said, her voice suddenly steady. This is precise. She pointed to the buried subsection again. This clause prevents any independent expert from examining the manuscript, which means the only truth allowed is theirs. The curator sank into his chair. The advisor took a step forward, face pale. You have no right, no authority to make these interpretations. She looked at him. Really looked. The polished shoes, the perfect cuffs, the confidence of a man who weaponized paperwork as effectively as a blade. You built a mechanism, she said softly, but you built it for someone blind, and he is not blind anymore. The advisor's eyes flickered with fear. Nadir leaned forward, folding his hands. If I had signed this contract, he said, voice like groundstone, what would have happened next? She hesitated. The truth was sharp. You would have wired the payment, she said. They would have released the manuscript, and within hours, before you could verify anything, they would have activated the warranty nullification clause. You'd be forced to prove fraud in a jurisdiction that favors sellers, even if you won. She breathed in. You'd lose more than money. A beat. What else? Nadir asked quietly. She held his gaze. Reputation. The news would leak that you purchased a falsified manuscript. Even if the courts ruled in your favor, the stain would remain. Scholars would whisper. Collectors would doubt your eye. Investors would question your discernment. She let the final truth land. You weren't the customer, she whispered. You were the exit strategy. Silence. Raw. Absolute silence. Nadir closed his eyes for one long moment, breathing in the weight of the narrow escape she'd given him. When he opened them, they softened, not with gratitude, but with recognition. She had seen the architecture of the trap. She had dismantled it. She had protected him when she had nothing to gain. The Swiss advisor spoke again, voice trembling with anger. Sir, this is absurd. You are allowing a waitress to destroy a historic acquisition. Nadir turned to him with a calm so lethal it silenced the air. She sees more, he said, than all of you combined. And for the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar bloom inside her. The smallest, most fragile spark of worth. Truth is oxygen to those suffocating under lies. The Swiss advisor tried to regroup, straightening his jacket, steadying his voice, forcing authority back into a room that no longer answered to him. The curator mirrored him shakily, as if posture might erase the evidence now scattered like broken glass across the table. But the illusion of control was gone. Nadir pushed the contract aside with a slow, deliberate motion, one that felt like a blade sliding out of velvet. His attention returned to her, anchoring the room around the only person who had spoken without calculation. What else did you see? He asked. A simple question, a devastating one. Her pulse stuttered. She didn't want to overstep. She didn't want to be the center of anything. Danger, praise, consequence. But the truth still vibrated inside her, a tension she could neither swallow nor ignore. She took a breath. "May I see the binding holes again?" The curator protested instantly. "She is not certified to—" "Bring it," Nadir ordered. The man obeyed. The manuscript slid back under the lamp, its edges catching the warm light like a confession waiting to be extracted. She leaned in, her shadow stretching across the page, like the silhouette of someone she barely recognized anymore. "The holes," she whispered, "don't align." The Swiss advisor rolled his eyes. Too fast, too dismissive. A mistake. She traced the air above the margins. Original stitching from this era used a staggered pattern, hand-tensioned, slightly irregular. These holes are spaced with mechanical precision. Exact intervals. No variance. The curator winced. "Even modern restorers don't create holes like this," she continued. "They follow the manuscript's natural drift." Whoever did this didn't understand that drift is part of authenticity. She paused, listening to her own heartbeat. "I think the vellum came from multiple sources," she said softly. "Different fragments, pressed together, resurfaced, cut into uniform sheets." The advisor's mask slipped. "That is a ridiculous—" "It explains everything," she said, turning to him. "Why the grain feels wrong. Why the ink sits on top. Why the margins look engineered. The pages were rebuilt, like a mosaic meant to fool someone who reads for aesthetics, not material truth." She glanced at Nadir. "These aren't pages from a single manuscript. They're pieces of several, stitched into a narrative that never existed." A hush fell. The curator folded into himself, collapsing in slow motion. The advisor stared at her like she was a threat he had never trained for. Nadir exhaled once, long, heavy, controlled. It wasn't anger, it was the sound of a man recalibrating an entire worldview. "And the contract?" he asked. "How does it connect to this patchwork?" Her throat tightened. This was the hardest part. "They weren't selling you a manuscript," she said quietly. "They were selling you a story, a perfect story. One so immaculate, so irresistible that you wouldn't question the seams." Her voice lowered. "Because seams are where the truth leaks out." The advisor took a step forward, voice cracking. "Sir, we can resolve this internally. There is no need for—" "Silence!" Nadir didn't shout. He didn't need to. The word struck like a gavel. The billionaire turned to her once more. Not demanding, not intimidating, expectant. "And you?" he asked. "How did you see what they hid?" Her breath caught. Her answer slipped out before she could stop it. "Because I used to study the seams." The room changed again, quietly, subtly, but undeniably. She was no longer a waitress. She was the only truth the room could still rely on. Integrity begins in the places no one bothers to look. For a moment, no one breathed. Her words hung in the air, like dust caught in a beam of light. Quiet, delicate, impossible to ignore. The seams. She had said it without meaning to, revealing more of herself than she had in years. Nadir's eyes sharpened with interest, not suspicion. The expert stiffened, sensing danger not in the billionaire, but in her. "Explain," Nadir said gently. Her hands tightened around the back of the chair. She hadn't told anyone this. Not her manager, not the people from her old department, not even herself in recent months. Speaking it aloud made the memory heavier. "I studied manuscripts," she whispered, "before everything collapsed." Nadir waited. She inhaled. "I specialized in marginalia and reconstruction mapping, tracing alterations, corrections, paper histories, the parts no one cared about, the mistakes. The curator flinched. The advisor's throat jumped. They understood what she was implying. She wasn't guessing. She was trained, skilled, dangerous to their scheme in a way they hadn't anticipated. "And now you serve water," the advisor said coldly, grasping at cruelty. "How convenient that your former aspirations align with this accusation." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence was its own indictment. Nadir's gaze turned razor sharp. "Tell me the rest." She exhaled. The truth tasted like old grief. "I had a scholarship," she murmured. "Lost it when the department's funding shifted, and I couldn't afford to stay. Debt kept growing, so I found work." She gestured at the apron. "Here. I thought I could stay invisible and safe." Invisible. Safe. Both lies. She turned back to the manuscript, forcing her focus to the page that had betrayed itself under lamplight. "The forger used mixed vellum," she continued, voice steadying with each detail. "Scrap fragments, bought legally or quietly. They resurfaced each piece to match thickness, then recut them into standardized sheets." She pointed to the lower margin, hovering, not touching. "Old vellum curls toward its past. These sheets curl in the same direction. That means they were pressed together after resurfacing." Nadir nodded slowly. She shifted angles under the lamp. The ink, it was applied all at once, not over years, not with natural fading. It has a unified sheen. That only happens when pigment is fresh. The curator opened his mouth, then closed it, throat working like he was trying not to drown. "And the script?" Nadir asked. She swallowed. "Rehearsed. Someone practiced this calligraphy until their hand became mechanical. The last lines should wobble from fatigue. They don't." The advisor stepped closer, face taut with desperation. "Sir, she is delivering conjecture with the confidence of a specialist, but she has no position, no authority." Nadir turned to him slowly. "Authority?" His voice dropped into something dangerous. "She sees what you tried to hide. That is authority." The advisor went silent. She took a breath and lifted one final piece of the truth. Sharp as a blade, heavy as consequence. "This manuscript wasn't discovered," she said. "It was assembled, a mosaic disguised as a relic, and the contract binds you to its fiction, even after you learn the truth." A beat. Nadir looked at the manuscript again. Really looked, and for the first time he saw the seams. "You've exposed everything," he said softly. She lowered her eyes, afraid of what that meant. For her, for them, for the fragile life she'd been barely holding together. But he wasn't angry. He wasn't threatened. He was awakened. Truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. The city lights shimmered through the glass like distant embers as the room contracted into a crucible. Heat, pressure, truth. The manuscript lay open between them, no longer a treasure but a crime scene. The experts hovered near the door as if escape might still be possible. But the billionaire's presence pinned them like specimens on velvet. Nadir folded his hands, elbows on the table, gaze steady on her. "Show me," he said. "Not tell me. Show me." She felt something shift inside her. Not confidence, she didn't trust that anymore, but a steadying, a return to the person she used to be. The one who worked late in silent archives, tracing the breaths of ancient scribes. The one who had believed knowledge could still matter. She stepped to the manuscript. "Look at the ruling," she said softly. The curator flinched. Now he knew exactly where she was going. She pointed to the faint guiding lines beneath the script, barely visible to an untrained eye. "Natural ruling from this period used a lead stylus. It leaves microscopic graining, not a groove, more of a whisper." Nadir leaned closer. These lines, she continued, are too precise, too consistent in depth. They were drawn with a modern calibration tool, probably a stylus with adjustable pressure. The advisor's voice cracked. "You are imagining artifacts." "I am reading them," she said quietly. Her fingertips hovered above the surface. "See here? The ink crosses the ruling line without feathering. Authentic ink would have sunk into the indentation. This sits above it." Nadir nodded, his jaw tightening with each revelation. She moved to the margin again. "And this is a reconstruction seam. The grain direction on the top half tilts left. The bottom half tilts right. It means these were two different vellum fragments pressed into one sheet." The curator made a soft, choking noise. Nadir exhaled through his nose, slow, controlled, furious. "Continue." She hesitated. The final detail was dangerous. It required speaking truth that might hurt him more deeply than losing money. But truth didn't wait for permission. "The text itself," she whispered, "is too modern." Nadir blinked once. "Modern? How?" Her throat tightened. She didn't want to humiliate him, but she also couldn't lie. She steadied her voice. "The scribe imitator used classical Arabic forms, but incorporated micro-flourishes that didn't appear until centuries later. The script is a mixture of eras, a hybrid." The Swiss advisor looked like he might collapse. She added barely above a breath, "A real Abbasid scribe would never have written this way." Silence fell again. And then Nadir asked the question she had been dreading. "How long have you known?" Her breath caught. She hadn't expected that. "I didn't fully know," she said. "Only that something was wrong. A pattern. A tension. I couldn't ignore it." He studied her. "Even though speaking could cost your job." Her chest tightened. "Yes." "Why?" She looked down at the pages pretending to be history. "Because truth is heavier when you carry it alone," she said softly. A stillness washed over the room. Nadir leaned back, hands steepled. The manuscript sat between them like a defeated conspirator. The experts stood pale and silent, their carefully built facade dissolving into dust. "You've stopped a multi-million-dollar fraud," he said quietly. "Prevented a legal disaster. Exposed a structure designed to manipulate me." "Huh?" She shook her head. "I just followed the seams." He smiled, barely, but unmistakably. "And that," he said, "is exactly why you were able to see what they hoped no one would." The advisor finally broke. "Sir, you cannot take her word over—" "I can," Nadir said, "and I do." The room's hierarchy shattered cleanly, beautifully, irrevocably. Fear lingers longer in memory than any lie. The collapse didn't happen loudly. It happened in micro-reactions. A twitch in the Swiss advisor's jaw, a tremor in the curator's hands, a shift in Nadir's posture that signaled something irreversible. The room was no longer theirs. It belonged to her truth. Nadir rose from his chair with slow precision, the kind of movement that made the walls themselves seem to brace. He stood over the contract, over the forged manuscript, over the two men who had tried to orchestrate his ruin. Then he spoke. "Do you know what I value more than artifacts?" he asked softly. The advisor licked his lips. "Sir, we can renegotiate." Nadir ignored him. "I value discernment, the ability to see what others fail to." He turned to her, and tonight, the only person in this room who demonstrated that is her. Her throat tightened. She stepped back instinctively, unused to being seen in any way that mattered. "I wasn't trying to—" "You were trying to prevent a mistake," he said. "One that would have followed me for the rest of my life." The advisor attempted one final tactic. "Sir, if you walk away from this deal, the sellers will pursue litigation." "No," she said quietly. All eyes shifted to her. The moment the provenance proves fabricated, the contract becomes void, and the clause preventing third-party examination collapses. The legal framework is built on a lie. She ran a fingertip over the air above the final page, her hand steady now. "Their position is weaker than yours. Much weaker." The advisor flinched. She was no longer guessing. She had reconstructed the entire scheme down to its legal skeleton. Nadir folded his arms. "Anything else I should know?" One more truth still lived in the margins, one she hadn't spoken yet because it felt too personal, too vulnerable. "Yes," she said. She stepped toward the contract and tapped lightly above a section of ornate text, again, not touching the paper, just pointing to the flaw. "This clause here," she said, "the one about jurisdiction. The phrasing mimics the style of a specific legal consultancy in Qatar. But the rhythm of the language, the subclauses and modifiers, those aren't written by a native speaker of any Gulf dialect." Her voice softened. "It was written by someone who studied the language, not someone who lives in it." The billionaire blinked. A strange silence followed. "Meaning?" he asked. She met his eyes. "Meaning I recognize the pattern." "A beat. Because it looks like the kind of drafting I used to do in my research notes." Slowly, very slowly, Nadir's expression shifted into something impossible to name. Recognition. Respect. A quiet astonishment. "You're telling me," he murmured, "that even their imitation of our legal language was flawed." She nodded once. They underestimated cultural rhythm. No matter how perfectly someone imitates the words, the cadence always reveals the truth. The curator made a soft, broken sound, defeat settling over him like dust. Nadir stepped back, taking in the entire room, the contract, the forged manuscript, the trembling experts, and her, the only person who had seen through every layer. "You saved me from signing away more than money," he said. "You saved me from humiliation." She shook her head, voice barely audible. "I just didn't want history to be rewritten for profit." He smiled again, quietly. Most people would have stayed silent. Her eyes lowered. "I spent years invisible. Silence was survival. But tonight..." A breath. Tonight, silence felt like betrayal. His gaze lingered on her, longer than anyone had looked at her in years. Then he closed the contract, pushed it aside, and said, "I owe you something." She froze. He wasn't talking about money. He wasn't talking about gratitude. He was talking about possibility. In the corner, the advisor and curator stared in terror, realizing the ground had shifted beneath them permanently. Exposure is not the end of a lie. It's the beginning of accountability. Security escorted the two experts out quietly. No shouting, no spectacle, just the soft click of the suite door closing behind them. Their empire of confidence dissolved the moment truth entered the room, and she had been the one to bring it. The dining suite felt different now, lighter, almost breathable. Nadir remained by the table, studying her with a calm that made her pulse tremble. "You shouldn't be carrying plates," he said. "You should be leading investigations." She tried to speak, but the words tangled. No one had spoken to her like that in years. He continued, gently but firmly. "Tomorrow morning, my foundation's forensic division will reach out. If you want a position, it's yours. No test, no hesitation." Her eyes burned, not from fear this time, but from the sudden possibility of a life she thought she'd buried. She nodded once. A small, shaking yes. As she walked out of the 43rd floor suite, apron loosened, breath unsteady, she felt something unfamiliar settle inside her. Dignity. Not given. Recovered. Outside, the city hummed below, unaware that her world had shifted on its axis. She pressed her hand over her chest, grounding herself in the new quiet. Sometimes the smallest voice in the room changes the fate of giants. If this story held you, if it made you lean closer with every part, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for the next one.